Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another deck guide, this time Reanimator in the modern format. If you do like these informative deck guides, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below. Now, Reanimator is a deck that has existed in different forms throughout Modern's format. Most of Modern's format, it was based around the card Garroyo's Vengeance. Garroyo's Vengeance is a instant speed reanimator spell for legendary creatures only, which kind of restricted what you could bring back from what your opponent was doing. You had powerful things like Gristlebrand, you had things like Borborygmos, Emrakul, but there was just no sustainable reanimation plan in terms of keeping the creature in play. You kind of had to do these broken, busted things the turn that you reanimate your creature. Now, you always had things like burial rites and such, which could facilitate a backup plan. Oftentimes would be in the form of a Gifts Ungiven deck, which would take the form of either a control deck or kind of this hybrid combo control deck that would allow you to reanimate something like an Iona or an Elvish Norn. Now, these were always kind of backup plans or kind of fringe players. Garroyo's Vengeance kind of went out the window when things like Simian Spirit Guide got banned because it was very much a speed combo deck. Now, Modern Horizons 2, much like so many other things, introduced new tools for new decks. And the card that it introduced to the format was the card Persist. Now, Persist is the first legendary caliber or legacy caliber reanimation spell that Modern has had outside of Garroyo's Vengeance. Now, that being a reanimation spell that is less than 4 mana. Now, you had Footsteps of the Garroyo, but it had much the same problem as Garroyo's Vengeance in that you had to sacrifice the creature at the end of turn. And there were only a select few creatures that could take advantage of that. Cards like Ghost Council of the Orzhova, or I guess that's... I'm trying to remember if I have the right name. Obsidian Ghost Council, sorry. Ghost Council of the Orzhova, different legendary creature. But you can only really take advantage of that, Gristlebrand, Emrakul, etc. Persist allowed you to play, these kind of more fair, normal cards. Now, the two cards that were in the primary role for this were Serra's Ascendant, which is a 7-mana creature that, whenever it comes into play, you name a card type, you have protection from those card types. And then Archon of Cruelty. Now, Archon of Cruelty was the best option simply because it has an ETB effect. Now, this is the best in the most matchups. It allows you to get a head-on card advantage, gain a little bit of life, and also kind of has a synergistic effect on your opponent, forces them to discard cards, lose life, etc. So that's kind of helped recoup the loss of one of the disadvantages of graveyard decks is you often have to take card disadvantage to either get the card in the graveyard or to find the missing piece. To that end, you use things like Tainted Indulgence to pitch Archons from your hand, get them into the graveyard, or you use a card like Unmarked Grave, which is a tutor that allows you to put something directly in the graveyard. Now, this allows you to put your Archon if you happen to have a copy of Persist in hand, or allows you to go and grab something like Burial Rites that has flashback to allow you to reanimate a card. Now, there were a lot of debates about how to build Reanimator for some time. I know Aspiring Spike and a lot of other people put some work into it, and a lot of people ended up settling on the Grief Solitude Muldrifter package. Now, Grief, obviously, kind of very powerful card. You see it a lot in Rakdos Scan these days, but I don't know that Scan was the first card to really take advantage of it. Now, obviously, Grief and Solitude pairing with the Rebirth effects are quite nice. This version has one copy of Malakir Rebirth, but really the original card to abuse these was Ephemerate. Now, you saw this out of the Elementals lists, you saw this out of various combo decks as kind of a way to protect their combo, etc. But this allows you to, pitch cast a Grief, pitch cast a Solitude, evoke a Muldrifter for 2 and a blue, get it back, etc. So, this kind of allows you to break that synergy of, the disadvantage of evoking creatures either dealing with your opponent's creatures on the battlefield, thought seizing them, Muldrifter drawing a bunch of cards, etc. So this deck now had an engine in addition to its graveyard angle. And there have been further innovations that have been kind of iterated on. The first being Aether Mage's Touch. Reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a creature card from among them on the battlefield and it gains. At the beginning of your end step, return this creature to its owner's hand, then put the rest of the cards revealed this way on the bottom of your library in any order. Now, kind of a random effect. You can't always guarantee that, an Archon or a Solitude or a Grief or whatever creature you need is on the top of your deck. And much like Rose Vengeance, it's kind of a one-shot deal. Not the best. So, how do you take advantage of that? Well, in the same vein as Mystic Sanctuary, you have Witch's Cottage. Now, Witch's Cottage is whenever it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more other swamps. When Witch's Cottage enters the battlefield untapped, you may put target creature card from your graveyard back on top of your library. So, say you've unmarked grave for an Archon but can't find the Persist. This is a way to put it back on top of your library. Cast Aether Mage's Touch. Get an Archon trigger, etc. Interesting innovation. I don't know how truly powerful it is, as obviously the creature doesn't stay in play. But, one-shot effects of these creatures are still very powerful. Witch's Cottage, obviously a nice innovation in the deck. That's kind of what the deck does. It's very much a one-trick pony. It has some mid-range elements to buy you time, but trying to put an Archon in the graveyard or a Solitude or whatever, take advantage of that. You have these kind of grindy engines with Muldrifter, etc. But this deck is very much set up to take advantage of the graveyard, and that is kind of one of the weaknesses of the deck, although you can potentially get a turn 2 or turn 3 Archon of Cruelty. Very powerful effect to have in the format. Sideboard, you have different answers, different threats. Prismatic Ending is kind of a catch-all, allows you to kill most permanents that you would care about. Rest in Pieces, any type of things like Tormod's Crypt, Relic of Progenitus, Soul Guide Lantern, any creatures that keep, things like Hushbringer that keep your ETB creatures from being relevant. It kills random things like Sanctifier and Vec. All these different things that can give you problems. Stony Silence, you don't see a lot of this card. This was a card more when artifact decks were everywhere, when Mox Opal was unbanned. You'd see it against decks like KCI, the old Affinity decks, etc. Now, sure, it has relevancy against decks like Hammer Time. It has relevancy against decks like Affinity. But this is primarily an anti-hate card. A lot of graveyard decks run or anti-graveyard packages for especially Urza Saga decks come in with things like Soul Guide Lantern, Relic of Progenitus, Tormod's Crypt, all these cheap artifact-based exile effects. Well, if they can't activate them, they're not much use. So this is kind of an anti-hate card measure. Thoughtseize, way to clear the way against counter spells, way to punch a hole in your opponent's strategy, primarily here for control and combo. Also, a way to check for hate cards out of your opponent in post-board games. Nasty Terasti. Alternative reanimation target. This comes in, blows up 3 permanents. The owners of those permanents get 3/3 elephants. You have a 9/9 beater. Sometimes you can even blow up your own lands, put, say, 18 power and play on turn 3. Very difficult to beat sometimes. Teferi Time Raveler. Helps protect your combo, or at least you resolve your combo. Also good against Cascade decks, good against counterspells. No, enough said. Ashiok Dreamrender. This one's a little more difficult. Spells and abilities your opponent's control can't cause them to search for their library, and then -1, target player mills their graveyard. Or mills 4, then exile each opponent's graveyard. Now, this can help mill you into your missing pieces, though a little bit risky because you only have Unburial Rites to play out of the graveyard. Really helps against decks like Amulet Titan, who are very contingent on searching their library for, with things like Summoner's Pact or Titan searching for lands, etc. And, it could be kind of a pseudo-alternative win con if you got enough of them against a slow, grindy deck or against decks like Dredge and Living End. Not the best anti graveyard card. Is a little bit slow, but does serve multiple purposes, so it has a reason to exist in these sideboards. Version number 2. That is the non-Ether Mage's Touch variants that exist. Now, they share a lot of the same cards. You're going to see Archon, Solitude, Muldrifter, Grief, Unmarked Grave, Persist, Ephemerate, Rebirth effects. You're going to see those. But where this one's a little bit different is you not only have Unburial Rites to put in the graveyard, you also have Priest of Fell Rites. Now this is another way to get rid of or bring stuff back from your graveyard. And another card that was printed in Modern Horizons 2 that is a very broken card that really doesn't see enough play. Obviously, 2/2 sitting in play, you have to pay through life. It does kind of signal to your opponent that, yeah, they're in some trouble. But it's a card that's very powerful, and it sees quite a bit. Did see quite a bit of play when it was initially introduced. A little bit slow to the party. Persist has kind of been the main graveyard reanimation spell, but it does give you a little bit of redundancy, which is important in a deck like Reanimator. This version has the Teferi Time Raveler in the main deck, and Prismatic Gangs in the main, get to kind of free up some of your sideboard slots. But, a lot of the deck's still trying to execute the same game plan. Sideboard, this one's a little bit different. Engineering Explosives, cleans up a lot of the hate pieces. Also, it can help slow down decks like Hammer Time, can come in against decks like Creativity, etc. Leyline of the Void, when you need your own graveyard hate. Dredge, Living End, Murktide. Though I don't know that you would necessarily bring it in against Murktide, but it is a card that you could bring in that matchup. Helps to slow down the opposing graveyard decks. Helps to slow down the Persist game plan out of some of the Creativity decks. So, interesting card to bring in. Relatively low opportunity cost, as you can usually cast it on turn 4 in this deck. Thoughtseize, we've already kind of covered. Fatal Push, way to slow down the early aggression of your opponents. March of Otherworldly Light, split card, answers a lot of the problematic permanents. Can answer Leyline, can answer Rest in Peace, can answer any of the artifact hate cards, force your opponent to blow it before they want to. Good overall solid cards. Leave No Trace, another interesting one. Destroy target art enchantment and each other enchantment that shares a color with it. This is primarily aimed at Rest in Peace and Leyline of the Void. Leyline of the Void can be annoying to deal with because you have to have like specific cards like Disenchant or something. Because oftentimes, Prismatic Ending isn't going to answer it because you don't have a 4th color, etc. Now, obviously, you could play a Triome to get that 4th color, but just really isn't worth it. And then finally, Serra's Emissary, the card I was kind of talking about. This is kind of the alternative thing. You bring this in situations where you expect your opponent to have either a one-dimensional game plan or there's a specific card type that you fear out of your opponent. For instance, Blue-Eye Control. Now, obviously, Blue-Eye Control has Supreme Verdicts. They have these different things that can answer creatures, Teferi, Bouncing, etc. But Serra's Emissary naming Solitude, all of a sudden your opponent's answers to your creatures are very small. They have a few Teferi Time Ravelers and maybe a few Teferi Hero Dominarias, maybe a Supreme Verdict or two. Suddenly they have very few outs. Or against a deck like, say, Zoo. You name creatures, all of a sudden your opponent can't really do a whole lot to you until they can remove your Serra's Emissary. And 7/7 ain't easy for even Tribal Flames to kill, so it has its place. Also, Affinity, name artifacts, they're kind of in trouble. Stony Silence, once again, we already kind of covered its purpose. But Esper is not the only version of Reanimator you might run into. The final version of Reanimator you might run into, and one I found quite interesting because, well, shares a lot in common with a certain scam deck. And that is Mardu Reanimator. Now, this deck is a mess. You have the reanimation ephemerate game plan, right? So you have the Furies, the Solitudes, the Griefs. So you have the scam angle of attack where you can have this 4/4 or 3/3 Fury sitting in play. You have this persist unmarked game plan of Archon or Solitude or Fury. And then you have this kind of random mid-range plan. You have Seasoned Pyromancer, Fable the Mirror Breaker. So you can really kind of play this weird game where you aren't all in on the graveyard plan, but you can have these like busted openings. You can have this busted reanimation plan. And you still have this mid-range game plan. This is a deck that actually really intrigues me. Because I am a sucker for a good reanimation deck. And as good as the Esper one has been at points, I really find myself wanting to try out this deck just because it looks so freaking awesome. And obviously beyond that, you have your Persists, you have your Priest of Fell Rights to bring things back. You also have Bitter Reunion, which allows you to pitch cards and randomly give things haste. So this deck feels like it's kind of the complete graveyard package and can really give your opponent fits in the early turns. The downside of this version, you don't have anything like Muldrifter to really recoup card advantage. Now, certainly you have Seasoned Pyro and Fable of the Mirror Breaker to kind of do these, trade cards that are garbage, or if you happen to be Hellbent with Seasoned Pyro and draw you a couple cards. So, not terrible, but you don't have any way to really recoup like that, and you are probably fairly vulnerable to graveyard hate overall. Sideboard options in this deck are a hoot. You've got Hallowed Moonlight. Now this is an anti-creativity thing, pure and simple. Obsidian Charmaw. This is when you need to blow up lands. So Amulet Titan, primarily here for Tron, is really easy to cast in the Tron matchup. Can bring it in against control, give them fits. Maybe something like Fury isn't good in that matchup, so you bring in some Charmaws, give them some fits. Hitsugo Consumes All. Pretty decent against Hammer Time. Slow value graveyard hate piece, although you have other graveyard hate pieces we'll get to in a second. And helps you to slow down those matchups where you expect to have some problems from early aggression. Wear Tear, anti-graveyard tech in addition to your prismatic endings. And then 4 copies of Soul Guide Lantern. You clearly don't want to lose to other graveyard decks. So, strength and weaknesses of these decks: explosive potential openings, decent mid-range game plan. Your vulnerability is graveyard hate. You're vulnerable to Leyline of the Voids, Rest in Pieces, etc. Now you have all these kind of counterplays to them, but still overall, deck you should be aware of. And honestly, I really knew about the Esper version before doing research for this particular video, and I must say I really like this Mardu list, and hats off to whoever did it. Now, the fact that there's 62 cards in the main deck, is that 62? No, 20... Yep, there's 62 cards in this main deck. That's got to get shaved if I ever run this list. But, alas, when people are playing fun stuff, sometimes they get a little overboard and don't make enough cuts. But, overall, Esper Reanimator, a little bit Mardu Reanimator, deck you should be aware of. It's definitely a blast to play. I've certainly enjoyed it when I played it, when the deck was first becoming a thing. It's been a while since I played a good reanimation list, but definitely a deck that can be fun in small bursts, and, as long as you're good with a little bit of inconsistency, because, well, you're an A+B combo deck, Sarah. But hope to see you for the next video. This has been John for MTG Nexus. Hope to see you next week.